Hi there, and welcome back to Into the Word. In the previous session, we started with wisdom literature, and we covered the books of Job and Psalms. In this session, we'll continue with wisdom literature, and we'll cover the books of Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Songs of Songs. I once heard that we should learn from the mistakes of others, because we don't live long enough to make all the mistakes by ourselves. That's actually how we gain wisdom. This is what the books of Proverbs and Ecclesiastes offers us. It is wisdom gained from the experience and mistakes of others. The book of Proverbs is a collection of short sayings based on other people's experiences. These proverbs and wisdom sayings come from different authors and from different sources. They actually even come from different cultures. The book of Proverbs offers practical advice on how to live a life of wisdom. Living a life of wisdom means that we live the way God wants us to live, in relationship with Him and in relationship with each other. The purpose of why the book of Proverbs was written is explained in the opening chapter of the book. Proverbs chapter 1, verses 2 through 4 says, "The Proverbs of Solomon, son of David, king of Israel," and here's where the explanation begins as to why the book of Proverbs was written, "for gaining wisdom and instruction, for understanding words of insight, for receiving instruction in prudent behavior, doing what is right and just and fair, for giving prudence to those who are simple, knowledge and discretion to the young." Sometimes people misunderstand the Proverbs and they don't really know how to interpret the Proverbs. So the first thing I want to do is actually explain what the Proverbs are not. So first of all, Proverbs are not promises. A good example for this is Proverbs chapter 22, verse 6. It says, "Start children off on the way they should go, and even when they are old, they will not turn from it." Now, quite a few times I've been among Christians or I've been in churches and I've listened to people who have raised their children, but when the children grew older or maybe when they were young adults, they turned away from following God and from going to church and be obedient to God's ways. And these people then, because they want to encourage themselves and they want to keep hope ahead of themselves, they quote this proverb and they say, well, if you teach a child the way it should go, then when they're old, certainly they will not turn from it. And they say, I claim this as a promise. But this is actually not a promise. This is really instructing people or parents and telling them that it is wise living, it is a good idea to teach people or to teach children to follow God and be obedient to His commandments. But it is certainly not a promise. It certainly doesn't say that this guarantees that when these children are older, that they will keep on or following God or come back to God. Secondly, a proverb is not a command. So let's look at Proverbs 22, verses 24 and 25. It says, "Do not make friends with a hot-tempered person. Do not associate with one easily angered, or you may learn their ways, and you yourself get ensnared." So again, this proverb is not teaching us to never make friends with a person who is easily angered. It is telling us that there is a risk when we become their friend, there is a risk that we will become like that, so we have to be careful about this. But it's certainly not saying we should never befriend people like that, because we certainly have a responsibility to share the gospel with them and share God's love with them. So we can ask ourselves, if a proverb is not a promise and it is not a command, then what is a proverb? Well, a proverb is a brief general expression of truth that is proven to be true by experience. It's a general principle for life. So for example, in the English language, here are some proverbs or some sayings or expressions, we could say, that are used here in the United States. For example, we say, "Look before you leap," or "Don't put all your eggs in one basket." Or we also say quite frequently, "There is no such thing as a free lunch." Now, when we understand these proverbs, we don't actually understand them according to their literal meaning. So when we say, "Look before you leap," it doesn't mean that we're telling or instructing a person to look around before they're going to actually jump. although that would certainly be a good idea. But the proverb is really indicating, or the saying is really telling people that if you're going to make a decision, consider the consequences and consider all the different options before you make a choice. So we don't understand this saying or this proverb literally. So in the same way, the Proverbs in the Old Testament don't always have to be understood literally. The Proverbs frequently contrast wise living or wisdom with foolish living or foolishness. For the Israelites back then and there, wise living meant living according to the covenant stipulations that God had given the Israelites. On the other side, foolish living was living as if there was no God. Psalm 14 verse 1 says, "The fool says in his heart, there is no God." And that's a pretty good definition of what a fool is or foolish living. So for us today, it means that wise living is living according to the instructions God has given us in the Bible. Foolish living is living as if God did not exist and we don't have to obey His word. The next book is the book of Ecclesiastes. A number of years ago, I taught at a small Bible college here in Arizona. And at the beginning of each semester, for each class, I would give the students a syllabus. The syllabus contained an overview of the material we were going to cover, and it also told the students what they had to do, what grade they could earn for each assignment, and when each assignment was due. And usually after going over the syllabus and answering their questions, I would say, you know what, remember, the sooner you fall behind, the more time you have to catch up. Usually the students kind of looked at me really perplexed, and they had this strange look on their face, and they didn't quite understand what I meant by that. And then they started to think about this, and then it dawned on them that actually I was telling them one thing because I really wanted them to do something else. It sounded as if I was telling them, make sure you fall behind, because if you fall behind in the beginning, you have a lot of time to catch up. But what I was really telling them was, hey, stick with your assignments and do your homework on time and turn your assignments in on time. Now, if you read the book of Ecclesiastes for the first time, it's as if the author is telling us that there is absolutely no meaning to life. In chapter 1, verse 2, it says, "Meaningless, meaningless, says the teacher, utterly meaningless, meaningless, everything is meaningless." Some translations in English will actually say, "Vanity, vanity, everything is vanity." And at the end of the book of Ecclesiastes, in chapter 12, verse 8, this phrase is again repeated, and it says, "Meaningless, meaningless, says the teacher, everything is meaningless." Between chapter 1, verse 2, and chapter 12, verse 8, the author of Ecclesiastes uses the word meaningless or vanity 31 times. So the recurring idea is that this is meaningless and that is meaningless. Everything is just meaningless. But what the author is actually saying is that material things and the temporal things of this world are meaningless. There is no value in the things of life that actually, in reality, most of the people in this world, including a lot of Christians, are pursuing. But then if everything is meaningless, then what is the point of life? What brings satisfaction in life if not material wealth and possessions or riches and fame? We have to get to the last two verses of the book of Ecclesiastes to actually get the message of this book and to see the positive words that the author is saying. There is something in life that actually does have meaning. There is something in life that is not meaningless. In Ecclesiastes chapter 12, verses 13 and 14, it says, "Now all has been heard. Here is the conclusion of the matter. Fear God and keep His commandments, for this is the duty of all mankind. For God will bring every deed into judgment, including every hidden thing, whether it is good or evil." So whenever you read this book, or whenever you quote from this book, from the book of Ecclesiastes, you should always keep these last two verses in mind, because this is really where we find the true meaning of the book. That brings us to the last book of wisdom literature, the Song of Songs. Song of Songs is a celebration of love shared between young lovers. They enjoy each other's beauty and the ability to satisfy their need for physical love. Song of Songs is about the wonder and majesty of a sexual or physical relationship between a husband and a wife. Now, throughout history, some Jewish and also some Christian interpreters have had a real problem with understanding this text literally. And as a result, they have spiritualized the message. Some Christians who cannot handle the idea that God would put a book in the Bible that is so explicit about physical or sexual love say that this book speaks about God's love for the church. But there's actually no indication in the text whatsoever that this book is about anything else than celebrating physical and sexual love between a husband and wife. So we've now covered the wisdom literature of the Old Testament. In the next session, I'll give you an introduction to the prophetical books and an overview of the book of Isaiah. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you next time.